addressing us. He's the country director for the World Bank for India, and has a very distinguished career, which you'll see in the detailed bio that you have along with your programs. So we're very honored to have you with us and for this special keynote address. So welcome to George Washington University. I think speaking here is fine. It looks like they've got it.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My daughter graduated from here a few years ago, and I told her that I was coming to present, and her complaint was, "You never showed up while I was an undergraduate." I said I was too scared to come and give a presentation while she was an undergraduate. So this is not going to be a presentation with the data and showing where India is on urbanization or infrastructure and finance. What I want to do is share with you some stories of policy making in India. And these are stories that I had the honor and privilege of having a window seat on. And so I want to share them with you and see how you react to them. The focus is on urbanization, infrastructure, and municipal finance, which I think is the next session. But again, it'll not be one steeped in economic theory and economic policy making, economic policy as much as the political economy of policy making. And I'd like to do it asking you to accept that my presentation is not as the new country director of India, but as Junaid Ahmed, who had a chance to see some of the policy making happen over the years 2000 to 2008. Second, let me share with you maybe a stream of consciousness and see whether you see a story emerging out of it. My bias in the way I present, it's always important to share the biases. I learned about urban and public finance the hard way in the middle of practicing it in South Africa, right after the end of apartheid. And South Africa was a country that really created the democratic South Africa on the basis of urbanization. So a lot of my perspective comes from there. And second, the perspective comes from reading about urbanization in India. And the first book I ever read was written by a gentleman named Rakesh Mohan, who influenced me tremendously in the way that I think. Well, let me take you back to the year 2000. I just moved from South Africa to India, and I got a call from a joint secretary of urban development saying that we understand you've arrived, and we met the city manager of Johannesburg, who said a few things about you. Could you come and see us? So I went to see the joint secretary, Mr. Sheel Banerjee. And Mr. Sheel Banerjee said, you know, we're very worried about urban water, and we're trying to develop a fund which will make access to water cheap. Do you think the World Bank can help create such a fund? So my first reaction was, are you sure the problem is cheap water? And he says, well, I was talking to the gentleman from Johannesburg, and he explained something about city reform and water. So I figured it was all about finding financing mechanisms around water. So began a conversation which lasted almost 2 years, in which there were a lot of exchanges between South Africa and India. And the Joint Secretary, very capable, pulled together a team from different states, from different parts of central government, to really look at the issue of how to do urban service delivery. And what came out of the South African story was you really need to look at cities as little governments, and that you have to empower these little governments to really manage with their citizens. And the idea of top-down service delivery or fragmenting the city was not going to work. So Mr. Shil Banerjee, spending 2 years of taking his team back and forth, began to come up with this idea of the City Challenge Fund. And the City Challenge Fund was really going to be a fund, a central government fund, which would incentivize states to actually empower cities to become, in effect, real local governments, and to do service delivery from that perspective. So, in effect, the long-run vision was, can you create credit-worthy cities run by mayors who would have the ability to be held accountable by their citizens in terms of service delivery? It was fascinating, and the City Challenge Fund was being created, and Rakesh Mohan then was the Secretary of Finance, DEA, if I'm not wrong, somewhere in there. And for him, this was, of course, absolutely music to his ears. So he supported that. And a major program was presented by Ministry of Urban Development to Minister of Finance at that time, and it was the NDA government, the current NDA government's first appearance, and they very much supported it. But just as it was about to enter into the budget, out of the blue, the most powerful entity of Government of India, Planning Commission, came up with an incredibly new idea, URIF, Urban Reform Incentive Fund. And their view was the real issue was land, and you needed to get urban land policy corrected and slum development arrested. So they suddenly came up with a fantastic program out of the blue of URIF, driven by what was at that time a fantastic analysis done by McKinsey. So here was Ministry of Urban Development in charge of urban policy, 2 years developing the City Challenge Fund, and suddenly Planning Commission shows up and said, here's this big program, will you please implement it? What was interesting was Mr. Shil Banerjee, man of tremendous integrity, basically said, I am unable to accept a program that has not been created by the ministry and really owned by the ministry. And his secretary, Mr. Kosal Ram, absolutely agreed. And they told Planning Commission, you can keep your program. Fascinating. So the Planning Ministry then said, okay, we're going to hand this over to the other part of the Urban Ministry. So there were two secretaries, one urban development, the other poverty alleviation. And so was created two giant programs of urban development in India, right, on two different wings. And of course, Planning Commission put its money and its weight behind URIF, which had a bigger budget, and the City Challenge Fund had a smaller budget. Now, this split was not just an issue of bureaucratic split. What it did was it split a program that focused on governance and municipalities from urban land, right? Governance, municipalities, and infrastructure from urban land policy. And all of you who know and have worked in urbanization know that the two have to go hand in hand. That you cannot develop urban infrastructure outside a system of urban policy, land policy. And so the two frameworks started. Just to make sure that you understand that it's not all about Government of India not knowing left hand and right hand, the World Bank had two teams, one working on the City Challenge Fund and the other one working in URIF. So the world of policy making with all these grand ideas comes and gets hit by sheer narrow interests in the way it gets taken forward. And of course, the implementation of these two programs really didn't move forward. End of NDA and the arrival of the UPA government, the Congress government. And the Congress government takes a view that it is time to truly have a great urban framework for India. And they created the Urban Mission. And to run that urban mission, what they did was they moved the Home Secretary, Mr. Anil Baijal, from home to urban. What I discovered was a man who was absolutely depressed. Here he was, the Home Secretary, and now put into something silly called urban development, right? And just to give you a sense, no new government would keep the secretary that did interior policing in the same as the previous one. They had to move him, so they pushed him in urban. So he was very, very depressed. So what happened was he began to learn about urban. And as he learned about urban, this man, very bright, began to say, hold on, the future of India is in urban. This is huge. So he began to say, okay, what do we do about urban mission? So he then took the City Challenge Fund and he took URIF and he merged them. The ministry became one. And out of it came the very famous JNNURM program, the biggest urban central government national urban program ever created in the world. Huge program. And I remember Mr. Anil Baijal doing a fantastic job of really as an efficient administrator of bringing together the political leaders around the notion that JNNURM would incentivize states, which in turn would incentivize local governments to actually invest in infrastructure that would be sustainable. I mean, this was unbelievable. And I remember finally the big meeting in which this was going to be signed. And he comes out of the meeting and he said, "Ho gaya." I said, "Sir, kya hua?" "Well, we did it. We have signed JNNURM." But he says, just with slight change. I said, "What's the change, sir?" And he said, "Well, you know, this is a reform-oriented infrastructure program. So what we've decided, we're going to front-load the infrastructure and back-load the reform," right? And I looked at him and I said, "Are you sure this is going to lead to the great JNNURM?" He said, "You know, the reality is you have to win step by step. JNNURM will eventually win." So what happened was in the previous NDA, the split between governance, infrastructure, and land policy, here the split was between infrastructure investment and reform and governance. So constant split in terms of the way cities were going to be managed. So basically, it was back to if you build, they will come. Right? It was back to handouts to states according to political machinery of how to make projects. End of UPA and the NDA government comes in, the new one. And the new one has created 2 new national urban programs, having shut down JNNURM, Smart Cities and Amrut. Right. Where they will go still remains to be seen. But I think that the lessons of City Challenge Fund, URIF, and JNNURM, in my opinion, offer 4 lessons. First is urban and urban policy making has started to take a central place in government of India. And that's not a trivial achievement. Like my country, Bangladesh, the rural is a very powerful force. And the rural delivery machine is a very powerful delivery machine and has driven a lot of policies in India. For the first time over the years, urban began to take a central place. So I think that's a very important victory. Second is a recognition in government policy making that you really need to link municipal governance, urban infrastructure, and land policy, that you cannot do this in separate ways. That's a second very important lesson. Third, which in my opinion is probably the most important lesson, that you cannot look at urban outside the federal system of India, the intergovernmental system of India. And that has three issues. First, that the emerging federal changes of India has always been about a tension between the center and the state. So as the center and the state are learning to become a true federal system, development, demography over time has created the emergence of local government. That's where a lot of the citizens' accountability, a lot of the economic forces are emerging. And certainly in urbanization, that's where it's leading to. So the emergence of local in this federation requires India to relook at its 73rd and 74th Amendment, which was created to recognize third-tier government. But it's a third-tier government that still responds to the state government and is not a independent third tier a la South African constitution or the Indonesian constitution or in fact the Brazilian constitution. The second part of federalism is the relation between center and the local. What you're seeing today in today's world and in the modern constitution is the center keeps the ability to send fiscal transfers directly to the local, not mediated through a middle tier. The mediation through the middle tier has led to that whole literature, what is it, the flypaper effect, where money gets stuck in where it lands first. So the strengthening of local government requires a direct relationship between the center and local. And there's ambiguity whether the Indian constitution can allow that to happen. And the third part of this federation issue is the nature of centrally sponsored schemes. India has massive central government schemes, and these schemes are very project-oriented. You know, I always joke that at one point it was so project-oriented, it probably determined the color of the ambassador car you had to buy with the government of India money, right? But they were only white ambassador cars anyway. But more seriously, the nature of centrally sponsored scheme to move away from top-down fiscal systems of projects to an incentive framework making the states move in a certain direction. And the arrival of the Niti Aayog, which has replaced the Planning Commission, they are in fact looking at changing the nature of the centrally sponsored scheme to be one of actually incentivizing states to make certain shifts. And I think that's a very, very important part of the story of urban. All of this is really around the politics of what I call political decentralization, creation of municipal and local government. And the evolution from City Challenge Fund to today's Smart Cities and Amrut is caught between this tension of a federation that's evolving. And I think the ability of India to move towards an urban policy that delivers economic growth and inclusive economic growth is where the cities will emerge as true municipal local governance. We don't know. But there is another path that was interesting in all of these years. It's what I called economic decentralization. And the economic decentralization really is, okay, we can't deal with the political aspects of municipalities, but can we deal with the delivery system itself? And when you look at the delivery system, it basically, the state government beginning to say, can I get the water, the electricity, the solid waste to become corporate bodies and to really deliver services to cities. So even if you don't have local governments, the state can run corporatized service delivery, almost like the Chilean model of service delivery. In working on economic decentralization, I discovered the challenge and power of intermittent supply, right? The challenge of intermittent supply, water and electricity, no one gets 24/7 water, no one gets 24/7 electricity. It's an intermittent system. And the intermittent system has huge cost. Water intermittent system has huge health costs. An electricity intermittent system means we have to invest in parallel power system as a private household. So there is a real challenge in terms of intermittence, the cost of intermittent system. The power of intermittent system that I discovered was incredible. So one chief engineer of a water company explained to me when I was trying to share with him why continuous water supply systems were more powerful. He says, look, he says to me, he called me beta. He's an older guy, he calls me son. He says, son, listen, what is intermittent supply? It means that water pressure is high in the morning, low in the evening, high in the morning. I said, yes. So you know it works like a water hammer. Yes. It means pipes break more often. Yes. It means I can give more contracts more often. Yes. So he says, why should I go for continuous water supply? Right? I was stunned, absolutely stunned. Right? All this theoretical story of 24/7, this and that, and he was giving me a reality of why intermittent water supply was in equilibrium. Another is you suddenly realize that judge and jury are the same. When the chief minister is the policymaker, regulator, and the chairman of a water board, there's absolutely no way you can create accountability in that kind of a system. Not because the chief minister is an evil person. Chief minister cannot distinguish between the role of a constituency saying, please give me a job, and my role as a water chairman, I can give you a job, right? No evil thought there. It's just, I can do it, right? Breaking that issue of judge and jury is one of the most powerful stories of India. I'll give you a personal story on intermittent supply. My wife is a Hindustani classical singer, and so she was one day giving a major performance in Dhaka city, where I come from. And unfortunately, Dhaka city at that time had very planned blackouts, intermittent supply of electricity. And so the place where she was giving the presentation, there was no backup generator. And so we said, my gosh, if you're doing a performance and the electricity goes out. Luckily, her cousin said, don't worry, my batchmate runs the electricity department. We will change the timing of the intermittent supply for that area. The ability to manage the delivery of electricity supply gives you such powerful political power in your hand. So where the political decentralization has its challenges, the economic decentralization of creating corporatized service delivery has its political economy challenges. Right? Not easy to break this. So basically, the last point, and I guess it's 2 o'clock is the next session.
We got a bit of a late start, but after a couple minutes.
All right. So let me say. So if it turns out that the story of political decentralization and economic decentralization are both difficult paths of strengthening urban systems, what are we left with? I think we're left with what I would call the corridor and agglomeration paradigm. And the corridor and agglomeration paradigm basically says, take advantage of whatever opening you have as you move forward in strengthening the urban sector. And here, take advantage of India's changing federalism. India's moving from an equalizing federation to a competitive federation. That gives you a chance to use centrally sponsored scheme in a competitive way to try and nudge some of these states in a certain direction. Second is, take full advantage of the Finance Commission. The one power in India that has been pushing decentralization has been the Finance Commission, which is a constitutional body, if I'm not wrong, and therefore can take independent decision. They are pouring money into the third tier of government, right? So it's strengthening the third tier of government quite a bit. So centrally sponsored schemes that are incentive-based can leverage the Finance Commissions. The other sort of opportunism is you're beginning to see for years what I call the Gurgaon effect. You have private developers creating satellite towns, and these satellite towns bring in certain agglomeration. The key is to connect the core to these satellite towns through transport corridors. These are all project-based and can meet and deliver to the political economy of existing states. But what they do is they continue to capture the agglomeration of the urban sector and continue to give the country the type of growth that the urban sector can give. We still don't know at what point does the agglomeration of cities begin to be the positive begins to get outweighed by the negative. I have to tell you, those of you who go to Dhaka city these days know what kind of traffic jams there are. And yet it continues to be the most productive city of Bangladesh. Globally, it's one of the most productive cities because it is the center of the garment industry today. where political economy is unable to give urban systems the type of governance that it needs, the agglomeration forces will allow project-based entry points into the Gurgaons of this world, corridors, transport corridors, and even entry into nudging the urban land policy forward. And I think that that is going to be, for a little while, at least for a decade, the path that India's urbanization will take. It's a messy governance story. It will be driven by states, but it'll be very much project-based shifts. I am not optimistic that we will get the type of shifts that we are seeing in other countries in terms of urban governance and local governance coming together. And the final point, I would say, where there is an opportunity is the rise of small towns. Small towns have different political economy and may offer the ability of states to use the public finance intergovernmental system to truly create the bottom-up municipal governance that we see. My father, who was in government in Bangladesh, always told me, learn to see through the eyes of the state. If you learn to see through the eyes of the state, you will understand how better to position the World Bank in support of what is feasible in the political economy of a nation. I am very grateful to people like Sheel Banerjee, Rakesh Mohan, Anil Baijal, because these are administrators who stood up for what they thought was right and who actually took on the machinery of politics to change. Building partnership with reformers such as they and figuring out how the World Bank can support as we move forward gradually is a political art. It is not one where we learn in GWU or anywhere else the theory of political change. So I hope that as you take forward your own work, please don't let economics get in the way of understanding the political economy of what change ought to be. Thank you very much.
Well, we are behind schedule, but Dr. Ahmad's presentation was so fascinating that I'm just unable to resist the opportunity to take 3 very short, something like 1-sentence questions. And so if there are such very short questions, then we can accept them now. There are 2 on this side. 1, 2, 3.
One sentence question.
1 sentence. And then there's someone behind you and someone in front.
What you said about cities and investing in governance in cities and strengthening the financial base of cities and so on, would the same argument be extended by you to villages?
Okay, let's take Sonal in the back.
To Sonal Desai, University of Maryland. To follow up on the same question, India is way behind in its definition of what is urban. And right now, there are these areas that are totally ungoverned by urban structures, urban laws, and yet they're urban. Is there any chance of redefining urban and sort of making some sort of a cohesive policy framework?
Yeah, these are the census towns, right? So let me take those 2 questions. 73rd and 74th Amendment absolutely say that local governance both ways, rural and urban. And I think that the chance of strengthening the panchayats the politics may be stronger there. I'm not sure, but it is exactly the parallel story. These are not separate. The politics and dynamic around it may be different, but absolutely the same. So now you've hit on something very important. A lot of if you look at the data in India, what you find is a lot of suburbanization happening. But the suburbanization is not the suburbanization of countries that have reached upper middle income and a natural decentralization of economic forces or residents. This is actually, in effect, areas that truly are urban in any definition, but still counted as rural. And I think that there is some incentive to remain rural because you may get more fiscal transfers that way. But they're definitely urban centers. The problem, by the way, because of land policy, is that this means that these cities sprawls is driving India's urbanization. And there's a cost to that. So we've done some analysis, which if you take Bangalore, if the floor area ratio of Bangalore was changed to be more optimal, instead of the city boundary being 8 kilometers out, it would be 12 kilometers out, it would be around 7 or 8 kilometers out. That would result in a shift from 6 or 7% of household income going to transport to down to almost 2%. So there's a real cost in that. But those villages are not villages. They are, in fact, and it would also mean that India is far more urbanized than the numbers that we have. And one more question here.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you brought up floor area ratio, because that was exactly what I was going to ask on. I'm Sam Asher. I'm at the World Bank Research Unit. And I was going to ask about floor area ratios, because to me, that's an example. It came up earlier in some of the sessions. It's something that's win-win-win. It's good for the private sector. It doesn't require big government outlays. You get more bang for your buck with the metro and other transportation infrastructure you're investing in. And yet, there's a total political logjam that means these reforms aren't being passed. And so given that you kind of started out your talk saying, I want to talk about the political economy of some of these things, I'd love to get your thoughts on why exactly that's proving such a difficult logjam to break.
You know, I don't know. I haven't done enough work in that area, but I do know that the rent controls, who owns the property, that there's a whole political economy that we do have to unbundle. This is a place where you could do things incrementally. You could take 3 or 4 major urban streets, etc., and begin to shift it. The developers that are emerging in India now may be a big political force to actually improve that. We have a study by Tara Vishwanath which shows the floor area ratio of New York City, Manhattan, and one of Mumbai, and you compare, and you see the one on New York is different parts of New York have different floor area ratio, and very much responding to the local economic needs. And I think that conversation is starting in Mumbai. Why shouldn't Mumbai have that kind of a storyline? What Mumbai is also getting a benefit from is a sense that it can become a financial nerve center for South Asia. And a lot of good studies have shown that doesn't only mean financial infrastructure. If you don't fix the city infrastructure, where are you going to get that human capital coming in to create Mumbai as a financial center of the future? But this, and you know, at the end of the day, no nation in the world can achieve fast middle-income growth without a vibrant urban sector. You know, it's what I say is it may take a village to grow a child, but you got to give those cities to get that child in employment, cities and towns. And that shift in mentality, right, had not happened in South Asia until the last, I would say, 7 to 10 years. And that shift has happened in India. People realize that this is now a big story. And that, I think, is the biggest hope that urban will get its place in the sun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.